Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Fantastic Four. So, really, I thought there was like a real hesitation about me ever reviewing this film because reasonably, I could really know exactly how all the other movies are going to eventually turn out when eventually I review them through me doing a Marvel movie. This one I wasn't sure. Like, I wasn't sure if this one was going to hold up or not. I didn't know if this one was going to be a good film when I finished it. And then once I finally rewatched this again, I'm like, man, did they deal with their powers a lot in this movie? To where then I started to realize, well, don't they do the exact same thing in the Silver Surfer movie? I'm like, yeah, they do. These entire movies are only tied via them trying to figure out their power set. Man, do they go in a very long, elaborate stretch of them trying to figure out their powers in these two films, to where we really have it to where the villain is just doing its own thing and just destroying everybody and killing numerous people while Mr. Fantastic is trying to figure out his new way of shaving. And you kind of wonder why there probably is a hesitation about there being a Fantastic Four movie again, but reasonably, like, people would be optimistic about it if they knew there were action sequences in a newer Fantastic Four film. If really in the trailers they immediately showed that these people are fighting someone, are doing and blasting away at somebody, then I think a lot of people would be so open to a Fantastic Four film, they'd be like, dude, take my money, kind of thing. Because they would actually see an action packed Fantastic Four film, which three times out they have yet to give us. They have yet to even try to give us any kind of action packed like film. To where I think honestly that's probably why Chris Evans is probably open to doing yet another Fantastic Four film, because hey, there was basically no action sequences in these entire films. It was just basically okay, flame on yet again. And plus also, like, I think probably Chris wanted to probably do a CGI character so that he probably wouldn't be in portions of the film. Like, he would appear every once in a while, but again, like, he would probably get carried by his CGI character to where he wouldn't have to be in the film the entire time. To where it would probably be easier to get those checks and whatever. And but here's the thing, though. I honestly would be open for this Fantastic Four uh, returning to the big screen, to doing another Fantastic Four film. Really, a lot of people could be like, no, I want somebody different. I want so and so. I want this movie to be this way. But here's also the good thing: if these Fantastic Four are to return, we don't have to do yet another origin story. We already have a Fantastic Four that has already been given a origin story, and we can easily just skip that part. We can skip it. Think of it that way. No origin story for Fantastic Four. We can just have them be the Fantastic Four and go through a hopefully much more interesting story this time around. Because going into this movie, yeah, they have to rely on Johnny Storm's powers malfunctioning. They have to rely on the relationship between Reed and Sue, the arguments or the just kind of looks that they have between one another. We end up having to also rely on Ben Grimm, who is seemingly a monster to everybody, and how recently Ben just trying to talk to somebody or just trying to get from point A to point B with everybody going like, ha! He's like, yeah, so I'm ugly, whatever, come on, yeah, whatever, I don't care. Like, dude, I'm just passing the street and like, like, stop! Like, stop doing that crap, come on. Like, you see me on the news, come on, like, get a grip, people. So, we go on into this film, and this takes me back to, like, saying like, man, this is such a great film. And now I'm looking at it, I'm like, yeah, I'm really seeing how not quite, not quite this movie. Like, we don't even have Doom actually like really be involved with the Fantastic Four. We end up having his stuff being done for bulk this movie away from the Fantastic Four, to eventually we end up having him kind of doing things uh, to eventually get at the Fantastic Four, but it's all from a distance. It's all just like, oh, okay, well, I'll concoct this plan so that way I can finish this person with a heat-seeking missile, or some other goofy concoction that isn't actually Doom fighting this team. And I'm like, dude, Doom is so ridiculously strong, and we barely ever see Doom actually doing one real battle sequence with the Fantastic Four. Like, this is such, watching it now, like a disappointing movie in all honesty. Um, Plus, it's also just kind of like, man, this is a really long film, too, with however long that it actually is. It just seems much longer because this film is just like a bunch of like troubleshooting with powers, and it kind of gets a little bit boring after a while. That there is not one time where like one of these Fantastic Four members are going after a purse snatcher or something that actually gives us some kind of action sequence somehow or another. But yeah, it just like that's where the movie just breaks down for me. That's how I feel about this movie when going into it. So I think it's about that time to go into spoilers about this film. A lot of people could probably debate this film. Some people might say that this is their favorite Marvel film. Some people might like that it's vastly different than all the others. And some people might like this Fantastic Four, or they might much more like the Fan Four Stick version of the Fantastic Four, and they might just be like, no, like I like a much younger Fantastic Four, and like I want them to build a franchise around these people. And a lot of people are probably hoping that eventually Fantastic Four is going to be infused in some movie or something down the line eventually. I think honestly it would be kind of cool if we had maybe quite possibly the Fantastic Four quite possibly showing up in the very last Spider-Man film. Like, I think that would be a lot like really very much more interesting than like another Spider-Man showing up. And a lot of people will be like, no, I want my Tobey Maguire and my Andrew Garfield in this Spider-Man film. But I think also people would accept if it was honestly just the Fantastic Four. Or I think honestly it would actually be cool if we got a villain version of the Fantastic Four in the MCU. Like, but then eventually we realized that like the Fantastic Four changes their ways and becomes good guys. Like, that would be kind of interesting to see how that breaks down. But anyways, going in here, I think it's about that time to go into spoilers if I haven't already. Because really, it's just about that time to go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time to spoil this movie. Really, there are scenes within this film that kind of have no value. They're just kind of a mixture of just a bunch of scenes that are just kind of like, oh, well, like, I guess, like, they just could have kind of popped these things in here kind of anywhere, because these scenes, like, aren't, like, that important going on here. But, plus, the way that this movie was shot was just so odd to me. Um, but, because anyways, like, there was, like follow the hot potato of just like where they're going with this story, or it seems like there's a lot more Johnny Storm scenes within this movie than anyone else's. uh, like, I don't feel like there is an even amount of stuff going on with the entire team. I think there might be more Johnny Storm scenes than there are Sue and Reed or even Ben scenes, but I could be wrong. Maybe that'll get people to want to rewatch this movie again to just kind of count like, oh yeah, Johnny or Chris Evans seems to be in this movie more than anyone else is, because it seems like they were gonna really uh, like push Johnny Storm more than anybody else because he's the comic relief in this movie. So, so let's go into this. So immediately we end up having both Reed and Grimm who are making their way to Victor Von Doom's uh, building, his headquarters, his whatever you call it. We end up having Reed who is groveling to Doom, to Victor, to try and get some funding together for them to go to outer space to try and get these plants into outer space so that way they can be hit by some cosmic storm cloud thing, whatever. They kept changing of what the actual thing was because they kept calling it a storm, a cloud, cosmic rays. They kept changing it throughout this entire movie to be like, what the heck was it actually? What was this thing that they were going to get hit with to make them their power thing? Because they should have had one consensus and one consensus alone, but it is what it is. So we end up having Victor, who is to revelish in that Reed had been groveling to come to Victor to use Doom's toys, uh, to use his ability to go into outer space, and so we end up having Victor, who is to have done his research and know full well that Reed had went to NASA and they said no, and so now Reed has to desperately go to Doom for this. So we end up having it to eventually Sue is to come in, and Victor is to also throw this in Reed's face that, oh hey, you remember my assistant Sue, your past girlfriend that I'm going to try to make my wife, Reed. Do you like? You feeling it? You feeling it, Reed? You feel that knife in your back that I'm driving? Because I hate you, Reed. But yeah, but it's also very interesting that Victor had thrown into the face of Reed how Reed is like the dumbest smart guy, and that it seems that Reed is just in magazines just as a thing of a joke, a butt of a joke, basically. So we go on and we end up having it to where Victor is letting Reed and Ben do this experiment and go along with them. And so we then have both Reed and Ben going, oh, okay, great. Like, yeah, we didn't want to work with Victor on this, but like it was our last resort kind of thing. So we end up having Sue, who ends up taking both Reed and Ben down through the elevator, and we end up having it to where Sue is to give Reed her phone number, and Reed is like, "Oh, well, I remember the number," and Sue's like, "Well, the number's been changed. That's too bad." Like really, just kind of like driving in that knife of Reed. It's so hilarious. Like when we had Victor doing that, now Sue is doing that. So we end up having it to a reasonably. Reed is trying to pitch for Ben to go and fly, of course, the rocket that they are to go on. And we end up having Sue mention it's like, well, no, I'm sorry. Like, we already have a pilot that is all good and well for us to do this experiment with. And so Ben is just going to be riding shotgun. But yeah, we're going to have a guy named Johnny go ahead and do the piloting of this rocket. So we end up having to where both Reed and Ben end up watching as they end up seeing Johnny, who ends up riding in on a motorcycle, kissing some girl who's driving in her car. We end up having reasonably, Ben is like, God, I do not want like Johnny to take over as pilot. Like, no, like I do not want to work with that guy. that guy is so egotistic and pig-headed, and it's just like I don't want to work with that guy. It's been 4 times now, Reed, that you've forced me to make these kind of decisions that I don't want to do. And Reed's like, or no, wait, like Ben says it was like 5 attempts or 5 times, and we have Reed was like, well, I thought it was 4, and Ben was like, well, yeah, this makes 5. So we have Ben Reed go in, and we end up having Sue going and tossing some jumpsuits for them to wear that form to their skin and keeps the hot stuff hot and the cool stuff cool, because Johnny has to explain that to him eventually when he comes in there. And so we end up having Johnny, who ends up arriving to do some like military cattle call or whatever, to where Ben is to jump up in attention, and we end up having Johnny, who takes a picture and is like, yeah, like camera $10 or whatever. Like the expression on his old superior's face when he's like second best is priceless or whatever Johnny ends up saying. So we end up having Sue, who gives everybody all their jumpsuits and explains how it works, and we end up having Reed, who ends up looking up and down at Sue, and he's like, he's like, yeah, these suits, these suits and these molecular fibers and all this stuff, like, man, like, this is really, really cool. And Sue thought that Reed was actually looking at her for once, but instead he was so excited about the suits and how they work. And so Sue was just like, I can't wait till you guys go go up with us. Like, I can't wait for this to happen. Yay, thumbs up, everybody. So we end up going and having everybody getting shot up to space. Let's try to quickly get through this now, because I want to get through the origin stuff like right a freaking way. Because good God, is that just a lot of hoo-ha and habba-da-douche and whatever else. Just like, really, I can't wait till we probably get to the sequel of us just seeing Silver Surfer doing things, and really me having to figure out how to explain all of that would be much more interesting. Plus, also, I might want to cover the Fan 4-Stick movie, because eventually maybe people might also like that as well. Plus, also, I actually like Fan 4-Stick. Maybe, like, I don't like the movie overall. There's stuff that, like, I just kind of go about that movie, especially when we get to the Victor Von Doom things where we don't actually know what his actual freaking power is in that movie. Like, it's just kind of like he's doing all kinds of weird, goofy stuff that I don't understand. Plus, I don't like how they kind of do the whole, like, the way of which to write in that, the way of which that everyone looks in that movie, and it's just, it's, you know, it's just odd. It's an odd film. But I like good portions of it. There's good acting in some portions of that film. But anyways, moving on. So, hence why I said, yeah, I'm going to rush through all this stuff, and then I slow down. So, it is what it is. So, we go into this thing called space, and so we immediately have it to where Johnny, Reed, and Ben, Ben is going out and getting into his spacesuit to go and set up these plants, and we end up having it to where Victor is to tell Ben before he goes, it's like, well, hey, like, I guess you're still doing the heavy lifting there, Ben. And Ben is like, well, yeah, that's right. Like, Reed does the talking, I do the walking. And so Victor's like, well, go ahead. Walk, buddy. Go ahead. Go on. Do it. Like, that's, like, you're freaking, like, you're the monkey of this operation. Like, anyways. So, we go on and we have Victor, who ends up taking Sue off to eventually give her the world, but also that tries to give her a ring. And Sue is like, yeah, you know what, Victor, you know what, that sounds great and all, but that Reed, though, So we end up having Victor, who ends up literally giving Sue the world by basically unlocking this window, showing her the actual world from under them. And so we end up having Victor, who ends up giving Sue the ring, and she's like, "Ooh, gee, you," and then we have Ben, who ends up talking to Johnny before he ends up getting out there, and so we end up having Johnny, who is to ask Ben, like, do you think Sue and like, do you think Reed is trying to like get back with my sister again? Do you think he's trying to do that? And like Ben is trying to say that it seems that Sue and Reed, like, hey man, like I think both of them are still really interested in one another. Like, remember, two hearts had got broken before, and and Johnny is like, "Oh, well, thanks for the compliment, Dr. Phil. Thanks for the little little thing there, Dr. Phil." And so we end up having Ben, who is to go on and go and deliver these flowers and arrange them and whatever, for eventually these things to get hit by this cosmic ray, to where we are to eventually have Reed starting to do some assessments, some hitting of digits, and he starts to realize that it seems that the cosmic ray, or the storm, or the cloud, or whatever the heck that they call this in this movie, had approached way too early. And so we end up having Reed, who is scrambling to tell everybody in the ship, hey, yeah, the cosmic ray thing, it's coming way earlier than I assessed. Oh man, I couldn't have calculated this. And so we end up having Reed, who ends up scrambling to go to get Ben and say, "Hey Ben, like you need to get back here right here and now. Like look to your left." And Ray's like, and Ben's like, "Well, like I haven't been done finishing assorting your flowers there, Reed." And so, but Ben looks and he's like, "Oh crap!" So we have Ben trying to scramble as quickly as humanly possible to get back to the ship, and we end up having Ben telling them, "Dude, I'm not going to make it." And they're like, "Dude, we're going to wait for you. Like, we're going to make sure that you make it out of here, or that you make it back to the ship." And so we end up having Victor, who's like, "Well, dude, I'm going to go and seal myself because supposedly all these shields should protect us." And Sue is like, "Well, I'm going to go and try to help them." And Victor is like, "Dude, that's a waste of time. Like, by the time that you get there, like it would be better off if you just stayed here." And Sue was like, "Well, no, I'm going to try to at least actually do something." So we end up having it to where eventually Ben is to eventually get hit with these cosmic rays, but eventually he gets hit back into the ship. And so they end up kind of closing off, but everybody just starts getting hit with these waves. Eventually we end up finding and seeing the kind of rough drafts of everybody starting to get their powers. That we end up seeing that Reed's neck kind of kind of gets disconjointed or whatever, and kind of starts to stretch. We end up seeing Sue, who's starting to become invisible. We end up seeing Johnny, who starts to a little bit get on fire, and we don't really see much of Ben, but we can kind of figure that out. And so we end up having it to where everybody is to go back to the surface, because Reed had sent them all to his doctors. So we ended up having seemingly everybody seems to be fine at first, but then eventually they start to get power symptoms. So we end up having it to where eventually Reed is to go and see Sue, who is sleeping things off, and we end up seeing that it seems that one of these nurses is not bringing her the right flowers, because orchids evidently is something that Sue is allergic to. Give her the daisies, or her favorite flower. And Sue is like, "Oh, he remembered," as she wakes up conveniently. So we end up having Reed eventually going and meeting Ben, and Ben is kind of asking, it's like, "Well, like, hey, that whole thing up in the space there, like, kind of wild, right? And Reed was like, yeah, like it was kind of wild. And Reed and Ben was like, yeah, like how could we have expected that? And Reed is like, yeah, I'm crunching through the numbers, and like I couldn't have expected it either. So we eventually have it to where eventually Ben is trying to ring both Sue and Reed back together. And so we end up having it to where Ben is orchestrating both Sue and Reed to get back together. And so Ben is with them eating some kind of breakfast or something together. We end up finding out that Ben is seemingly having a rough go and really having issues with digestion, and he ends up leaving. Oh, there's also a really fun part as well that I completely forgot about. So, when Ben is to wake up uh, from being from space to now being here, we end up having Johnny who ends up coming to Ben and saying like, "Hey, all of us are fine, but Ben, we had the top doctors and we just tried to fix you." And and so Ben is like, "Give me a mirror." And Johnny's like, "No, wait. Like the shock could just like kill you right here and now." And so we end up having Ben getting the mirror and seeing that his face is absolutely normal. And Johnny's like, "Yeah, like we tried as much as we can, but the only thing that we couldn't save was your face." And then he leaves. And then so Ben flings the mirror to try and hit Johnny, but of course it doesn't. But I thought that scene was hilarious, where where Johnny was like, "Be strong, be strong, Ben," and like he looks at him like, "Oh, I'm fine, I'm perfectly fine." But anyways, so we go on and we have Johnny who is immediately like, "Dude, I am bouncing. Like, I am out of here." Like, everybody did all kinds of tests and it seemed like I'm fine. So, if anything, I'm seeing some sick Alps that need to be snowboarded. And we end up having Johnny who is to basically have this supposedly sexy nurse that's what it says in the IMDb. We end up having Johnny and this nurse going snowboarding together. And so eventually we end up having Johnny who ends up going and snowboarding with this girl to eventually, while snowboarding, he ends up turning on fire. And we end up having the nurse saying, like, "Hey, you're on fire." And like Johnny's like, "Well, yeah, you're really good too, and really attractive and all kinds of things." Because we eventually have it to where also Johnny is getting like his temperature tested by thermometer, and it's skyrocketing to like 200 and something. We end up having the nurse saying that, "Oh my god, you're hot." And he's like, "Oh yeah, like, and you're like really attractive too, and I'm not afraid to cry." Like, and I take long walks on the beach and so on and so forth. So we have it to where Johnny is to seemingly burst into flame, to where he is to basically fly off of this mountain to crash somewhere into the mountain, to where he's to bizarrely create some kind of snow jacuzzi or some kind of winter jacuzzi, to where we end up having Johnny who is to ask the nurse, like, "Care to join me?" So goofy. So we end up having Ben who ends up leaving this dinner to eventually have Sue and Reed talk again about the relationship, on how Reed is mentioning to Sue that he's happy that Sue and Victor are an item and that they're together. To where really Sue is harping on the fact of like, well, yeah, but what about the possibility of you and me? Like, what about us? Like, where does that leave us, Reed? And so we eventually have it to where Sue goes into this dialogue about how Reed, one, I think at some point wasn't the best conversationalist, but how Sue wanted to be heard and wanted to be seen. And we end up having Sue eventually who cannot be seen because she ends up turning invisible. And Reed is starting to realize this, and he's like, "Yeah, Sue, look at your hands." And to where Sue is like, "Oh my god, I'm actually invisible. Isn't that wonderful?" And so We end up having Sue, who ends up dumping this thing of I think it's like cider. Like it looks like a champagne bottle, but I don't think it's champagne. That seems a little weird to have that during this time of day. We end up having Reed, who ends up stretching out his arm, showing his stretchy ability. Just say, "Wow, I have stretch power." That's Mr. Fantastic. So we go on and we end up having Johnny, who ends up rushing into this place, I guess conveniently hoping that Reed and Sue would be in there, and I guess they were. To where Johnny was to explain, "Hey guys, guess what happened to me besides being almost like naked because all I have around me is a coat to really just have you guys not see a thing." So we end up having Johnny, who explains that his whole body had turned on fire, and that we end up having Johnny, who keeps snapping his fingers to like light up his hand, to where he's like, "Picture that, but everywhere." Just the goofiest thing. So we end up having now wanting both Sue and Reed and Johnny to all go see what is happening with Ben. Ben is to wake up in utter agony, and we end up eventually having it to where he is to eventually start breaking his bed and all kinds of other things. So we end up having Johnny, Sue, and Reed making their way back to Ben's room to find that Ben's room is locked. So we end up having Reed, who ends up using his bizarrish, like stretchy power to be able to get through this door, to be able to unlock it and then open it. And of course, we end up having Johnny, who's like, "That's just weird." So we end up having, eventually they open the door to realize that Ben is now gone, that he had gone back home. So we end up having Ben, who had come from a train to make his way back to his wife Debbie. So we end up having Ben, who ends up calling up Debbie to say that he's home, and we end up having Debbie saying, "Oh my God, you're home, baby?" And he's like, "Yeah, but like I want to let you like in on something. Like I'm a little bit different." And so we end up having Debbie going to see Ben, and so Ben is kind of like covering himself, and Ben mentions like, "Hey, remember what we used to say?" Like, remember what we used to say, that together forever, no matter what? And so Ben ends up like unsheathing himself to show that Ben really is different, to where Debbie is now freaked out to the point of her running away from Ben, and Ben is like, "Dude, it's still me. I'm still me." But sadly enough, the horror story that ends up happening. So we end up having Reed, Sue, and Johnny, who are to go to the Baxter building. We have it to where Reed is evidently taking his work home with him, and eventually, like we'll get there because I think Ben has to be with them at that point. But like kind of quickly mentioning that, but then realizing that eventually they're going to get Ben with them. So we end up having it to where they are trying to figure out where the heck Ben is. And we end up having Ben, who is at this bridge, who is to be talking to some weird bird that craps on his shoulder. So we end up having it to where it seems there is some guy who is going to toss his briefcase off to the side to jump off this bridge. And we end up having Ben, who is to try to stop this man, to have him say like, "Dude, you think that your life is worse?" And we end up having this guy who's like, "Oh my God, like what a monster, what a freak, what a whatever." And we end up having this guy who is going to take his life now almost accidentally like going into the midst of traffic within this bridge, and going to fall off this part of this bridge, which gets him into traffic. So we end up having Ben, who ends up jumping down because this guy falls off this little like middle section here, to where we end up having Ben trying to stop this truck from running this guy over, and so Ben ends up like kind of blocking this truck from running over this guy, and so we eventually have it to where Ben ends up uh, tries to get this trucker from out of his vehicle, and so we eventually have the police arriving, who are like, "Oh my God, this monsterish person." So we end up having Ben drop the trucker and then run off to eventually get shot at, to where the bullets just bounce right off of him. So eventually we get Reed, Sue, and Johnny to figure out where Ben is. And so we end up having both Johnny, Sue, and Reed trying to get to Ben and try to talk him down. And we have them having a problem now because there's a crowd that is around this bridge. So we end up having Reed, who tells Sue, it's like, well, hey, you need to be invisible so that way you could get through this crowd better than either Johnny or Reed can. And plus, Johnny isn't having the ability to fly, so Sue, get going. So we end up having Sue, who ends up starting to take off her clothes to eventually have it to where she's phasing in and out, to where Sue is like, oh my God, why did I do this? So we end up having Johnny mention is like, God, I'm going to have nightmares forever. And Reed is just like, thumbs up. I wanted to see I want to see some of that Sue. And Reed is like, Sue, you've been working out. Sue, you've been really working out. You've been bun busting and toning it out. Bravo, lady, bravo. So we end up having Sue, who ends up turning invisible and then bum rushing through everybody to where Johnny, Reed, and Sue can make it through here. Eventually, we get a problem with this bridge to where eventually we end up having the police department coming and all kinds of things. There seems to be a fire that ends up erupting with car accidents and all kinds of things. So we end up having Johnny, Sue, and Reed trying to save some people. We end up having Sue having to do a force field to block these flames from exploding all up in this bridge. And she ends up getting a nosebleed. So we eventually have it to where eventually this fire truck is to eventually fall off to the side of this bridge. We end up having Ben, who ends up going and grabbing this fire truck and trying to push it back from it sliding completely off this bridge. We end up having one firefighter who is on the ladder of this truck, who ends up almost falling completely off or who ends up actually falling completely off this fire truck to eventually fall into the water. But before he does that, Reed comes elasticing. I don't know the right word. Stretching in. Yeah, there we go. Reed comes stretching in to grab this guy and retrieve him from falling. So we end up seemingly having the Fantastic Four now being heroes, and immediately they are dubbed with this name. We immediately end up having these guys all in some tent to be checked on and whatever, and everyone is fine. We end up having some police officer who is like, yeah, you guys are dubbed the Fantastic Four, and somebody needs to go out there to deal with all this, like, this news and all this stuff, like all these people that are desperately wanting to hear your guys' story. And we end up having Johnny, who immediately asks Ben, where are your ears? To where Ben is just looking at him and he's like, whatever. So we go on and we end up having these Fantastic Four go out there, and here's the thing. So we end up having Victor, who is watching on with this news feed, and we end up having a couple things happen with Victor. When Victor ends up coming back, we end up finding out that it seems that the stock had plummeted from this whole space debacle, and that really Victor is almost going to be like soon out of money and out of a technical job, whatever. So we end up having it to where Victor is to eventually have to get needles put into his the side of his face because he has a scar. We end up having to where Victor is to go on to try to get some kind of Larry King or some kind of interview so that way he can do some damage control on this whole space event. But then eventually, once the Fantastic Four like come onto the news, we end up having every single news outlet or whatever canceling to try to cover this Fantastic Four thing instead of Victor Von Doom. So we end up having it to where we end up having the Fantastic Four going out to the news people to just kind of do some damage control to say what happened to them. Like, they're not freaks, they're not from outer space. If anything, they're just like normal guys like you and I who are to have just gotten some superpowers by going into outer space. So we end up having Reed confirming to people it's like they're trying to come up with a cure for all of their ailments, and they're putting their lives on the line to try to figure this whole thing out. So we end up having some news reporters asking Johnny if he could fly, and he's like, "Yeah, like I'm trying to work on that." So we end up having all the Fantastic Four going to the Baxter Building and eventually trying to assess their powers. We end up having Ben, who ends up getting x-rayed so that way they can see that his entire body is really and truly made out of rock, every single organ and everything like that. We end up having Reed, who ends up trying to eventually get a thing of toilet paper when he's taking a dump. We end up having Reed, who is eventually trying to figure out how to shave, now being stretchy. We end up having Reed, who is to take Sue to have her try to figure out her powers and how it exactly works. To where we end up having eventually Sue accidentally blasting Reed with some kind of invisible weapon. To where eventually we end up having Reed mention to Sue, it's like, well, like, you dumped me, right? And we end up having like this whole relationship disagreement yet again between Sue and Reed, to where they kind of mentioned about ergo I left and ergo blah blah blah. So we have it to where also they are to try to experiment on Johnny and see how hot eventually he can get, to where eventually he ends up going far too hot, to where they end up having to basically tell Johnny that he is going to have to stop being so hot or he'll get to supernova, which is the power of the sun, which will basically not only kill him but everyone in the world basically. So toward Johnny's like, oh, okay, supernova bad, which was the bizarrish like goofiest thing. So we end up having eventually that we find out that Victor is starting to see where these guys are at with kind of experimenting on themselves. We end up having Doom, who ends up going to the Baxter Building to talk to Sue about like, well, hey, like I can take you to my best doctors and we can see how to help you. And Sue is like, well, no, like I really want to be with my brother Johnny, and it seems like Reed is really coming up with answers right now. And Victor is just like, oh, like, okay, so really, like, we end up starting to see that Victor is starting to realize that Reed has basically tried to steal every single thing away from Victor, and we end up having Victor starting to get really, really angry about it. So we end up eventually having Victor, who is to go off and tell Reed that one, he needs to pay his electric bill, but also like we end up having really Reed and Victor kind of like placing the blame on one another on how really Reed is or Victor is blaming Reed for this whole situation and how he miscalculated, and Reed is just like, well, like we should have probably tried to stay like protected under the shields and blah blah blah. Like they're really trying to trade blame and whatever between one another because they just hate one another. So we go on to eventually have Victor, who is just so upset that he ends up punching this. He ends up punching the elevator, and he ends up putting a massive dent in it, to where he's realizing like, wow, like my hand is now turning very like metallic. So we end up having Victor, who ends up going to a doctor, who is to basically mention it's like, well, yeah, like your body is starting to change from human skin to now metallic skin, just like the shields that Reed was to tell them that they were going to be protected by. So we end up having Victor, who is now going to basically turn into a freak. And we end up having this doctor that's like, well, I don't know how far along that this skin disease is going to happen. Maybe I have to call CDC and quarantine us all off because, like, this could be a brand new illness that we might not be aware of. And so we end up having Victor, who's like, well, I'm a face of $1 billion company and I can't let this get out there. Like, no, like, so we end up having Victor, who ends up killing this doctor and wanting to go to a second opinion. So we eventually have it to where Victor is to eventually realize that eventually once he starts to grab some silverware of sorts, that he has some kind of electrical ability. And so we end up having Victor, who's like, this is kind of interesting. So we eventually have it to where Victor decides to go and try to kill the man that had tried to take his business away from him, Ned Cecil. So we end up having Doom, who goes off to go after Ned, and Ned is in this parking lot, and we end up having Ned, who tells Doom, it's like, well, hey, like, if anything, maybe this will actually do you some good about you, like, losing this business and going off. Like, maybe you can go to Latveria, and maybe that'll work out for you. So we end up having Victor, who is going to put a huge lightning bolt in Ned's chest to have him get killed off. And I was like amazed how actually like gruesome that they actually like showcased that hole through that guy's chest. I was like, wow, cool. Like, this is the coolest part of this whole entire movie. Let me pause here for a second. I want to reset. All right. So we end up having Ben, who ends up going off to eventually go and try and get a drink at a bar, and it seems like he cannot be able to get that drink no matter what he tries to do. We end up eventually having Ben kind of gripe about how like horrible his life is now, and we end up having Alicia, who's ending up saying like, well, like things can't all be that bad, and Ben is like, well, like you haven't seen my face. And so we end up having Alicia kind of like touch him up and down, like not even just his face, like his chest and everything. And eventually Alicia, like the only thing that she cares about is that like, oh, he's so sad. So we end up having to where Alicia seems to immediately like be winning Ben over bizarrely. And so we end up having Victor's plan of trying to really get Ben out of the way of so that way eventually we can have it to where Victor is going to get to Reed and all the other Fantastic Four to take them all down. So we end up eventually having Victor, who is to talk to Ben, and so we end up having Victor telling and whispering sweet nothings to Ben, basically telling him it's like, well, hey, like, how far do you think Reed really is to coming up with a cure for you? Like, when really looking at it, Reed is probably going to try to delay coming up with a cure for you, Ben, because reasonably all he cares about is spending more time with Sue, not with curing you. And we have it to where Ben is like in the back of his mind is like, well, is that really and truly true? Could be. Because really, we end up having Ben who is at that bridge, and we end up having Debbie who ends up giving Ben their engagement ring back to him, and we end up having Ben who tries to struggle to collect it and he can't. We end up having Reed giving him back the ring and putting it in his hand, and we end up having Reed who's like, "I swear by every fiber in my body that I will get you to be Ben Grimm again." So we end up going along, and we end up having Reed who is coming up with some kind of uh, we end up having Ben come up with this little pod thing that is going to try to recreate the storm again, to try to possibly reverse their powers. And so we end up having Ben, who is frustrated of like, well, how soon is this going to work, Reed? And Reed is like, I don't know. And he's like, you don't know? And also we end up having Johnny, who is getting cabin fever, that it's like, dude, I thought we'd only be here for a week. So we end up having Johnny who ends up running off to some motocross event, and he ends up going and trying to do some motorcycle stunt, which he ends up failing on trying to do because he wanted to do something different, but he ended up failing at it. But we end up having Johnny who ends up going flame on, and then he ends up flying, but then ends up like crashing and burning. To where we end up having Johnny who ends up ripping off his motocross gear to show the Fantastic Four suit that Reed had put together. We end up having Reed, Sue, and Ben all watching on TV, seeing Johnny make up names for every single one of the Fantastic Four, and basically telling everybody like what all happened to them and everything like that. And Ben is kind of hearing all the names, and like Reed's name isn't all that bad. Sue is Invisible Girl, and Sue is like, eh. And so we get to, of course, Ben getting his name, and of course Ben is called the Thing, and Ben is like, like come on, like, and we have it to where Johnny is mentioning like beforehand that every superhero team needs a mascot and so on and so forth. So we end up having Ben making his way to this motocross event to try to get at Johnny because he just hates how much of a hothead he is and how many decisions that Johnny made for this team by naming all of them and calling them their names and everything, to where Johnny is too much of a hot dog and a hothead to uh, really not think about things and just act. So we eventually have it to where all the Fantastic Four are basically telling Johnny to basically, once they make it to this event, uh, that really, like, Reed is telling Johnny that he needs to think before he acts, and that really there's got to be something more to what they're doing if they're going to become superheroes than just money and women and fame and whatever. And we end up having Johnny who's like, well, is there anything else higher than that? Like, is there any more? Is there a better purpose than all of those things that you just mentioned? To where it kind of shuts Reed up. So we eventually have it to where Sue is like, God, you are so hot headed and you never think. So, plus before I remember Ben saying that Johnny is like blonde ambition and whatever. So we end up having Johnny and Grimm who are fighting it out, and I'm kind of like surprised how exactly I could have easily like talked about this entire movie, because I thought I was like, oh my God, I'm gonna have a huge amount of problems this entire time talking about this entire film and doing it all out. And I'm just surprised how I didn't have a stopping gap or whatever, because I thought I was going to have a ton of problems talking about this film for how it kind of goes along and it's kind of all over the place. So we end up having it to where Ben and Johnny are going to have a fight out, to where we end up having Ben who ends up punching through Reed to hit Johnny, and Johnny goes flying and hits some sign. And here's where we see a massive, giant amount of logos and sponsorship for this movie conveniently placed somewhere for them to have all these sponsors for this movie, and that's why it looks as good as it does. And plus, like, during this time, they didn't have the Disney banner or whatever to help them. Plus, this was also a Fox film, so yeah, this film desperately needed a ton of sponsors to help them make it through this film. So, hence why it doesn't have a huge amount of action scenes, I guess, because they like it's a Fox film, which means that it wasn't exactly like with the exclusion of X-Men, which I think X-Men was a great like Fox Marvel film. We really had it to where like the Fantastic Four franchise just suffered because there wasn't enough action in there, and there wasn't enough like every single movie tied Victor Von Doom in it, no matter what. Which I understand that, but then again, like I think at some point we want to like a Fantastic Four with some other kind of Rogues Gallery member in it somewhere, to where it's not completely utterly tied with Victor Von Doom. Um, to where we tried to do that with Surfer, but Surfer was supposed to give us Galactus, and Galactus was what he was in that movie. So we end up having Ben who punches through Reed to get to Johnny, and Johnny goes flying, and so we end up having Sue stopping both Ben and Johnny from fighting by using her powers. So we end up having Ben who ends up walking off, and we end up having Johnny who ends up walking off as well. So we end up having it to where Reed is now scrambling to try to get this pod thing to work to recreate the storm to help them get fixed because he knows how desperately Ben wants to get rid of being the thing anymore. We eventually have this very interesting dialogue between Ben and Sue, how uh, how like Ben is talking about the relationship with Reed and Sue and how she's been waiting for so long for Reed to step up and say something and do something. And we end up having also who Ben is telling Sue that like if anything like all of your guys' powers doesn't have the burden of which mine does. It's like if anything, Ben would have loved to have become invisible, and like that is the most like heartbreaking part of this entire movie when Ben is to wish that he could have had Sue's powers, or really just in one sense that Ben doesn't want to look like a freak to everyone, and how everyone is looking at them and staring at them to where we have Ben yelling at them to like because he hates all the people that are gawking at him. Uh, and plus you get this like huge like brash of just a ton of people all just staring at them. They're just like, oh, like, oh, like, oh, I'm gonna drink my coffee and look at this freak some more. So at one point we end up having Sue who eventually walks off from Ben, and eventually like she ends up like having to forcibly turn invisible because all of everybody is like, oh my god, like Sue Storm, you're invisible woman, like my daughter thinks that you're her favorite and whatever, and Sue ends up like getting naked so that way she could run off. But anyway, so pushing on, so we end up having Reed who is desperately trying to scramble to get this experiment to work, and he ends up failing at it miserably to the point to where he still has his power. Sue tries to collect him and try to say that Reed needs to go on a break, that that they need to like go out and like try to like not think about this so they can think about it kind of thing. So but eventually we end up having Reed who ends up going off to eventually go and like get some rest because like the experiment just didn't work. Because really we have Reed who's like, well, I guess I should try to just test it on myself to try to get it to work. We end up finding out that Reed is mentioning to Sue that there wasn't enough power for this experiment to work. And so Victor is I guess spying on Reed and Sue, and he's like, there wasn't enough power. Hey, hey, minion of mine, get Ben Grimm to get to the Baxter building. So we end up having Victor, who is going to do this machine and fix it to where we end up having Ben, who ends up turning back into Ben. So while that is going on, we end up having Victor, who ends up turning into a much more stronger being. And so we end up having Vic, who ends up going and knocking out Ben. Reed ends up going and realizing what had happened. And so we end up having now Doom, who is going and attacking Reed. And we end up having Doom getting the best of Reed to where we end up having Reed flying out of this building and almost trying to stretch and be able to touch any piece of this building so that way he won't fall to his almost death. We end up having eventually Doom, who ends up going to the bottom of the building and retrieving Reed to where they are to go back to his place, to where we end up having it to where Victor is super cooling Reed so that way he can break his fingers and put him in absolute pain. So we end up having both Johnny and Sue making it back to the Baxter building, trying to revive Reed or revive Ben, who is now down and he's back to normal. And we end up having like Sue and Johnny freaking out about how like Ben is back to normal again. I also think that it was also funny where Johnny at one point brought a action figure rough draft of what Ben was going to look like as a thing, and he has a catchphrase that it says it's clobbering time. So we end up having it to where eventually Doom is taking out Reed with the freezing thing, and we eventually have it to where Victor is to eventually go and get a heat-seeking missile to go after Johnny. So Doom ends up shooting out this missile. We end up having Johnny, who ends up seeing the missile, and we end up having Johnny, who is now going like, dude, there's only one thing that I have to do now. I absolutely need to fly to get away from this rocket. And so Sue is like, dude, you need to think. And he's like, I never do. And so Johnny flames on to try to get away from this rocket. He ends up tossing a flame up, and then he tries to depower to try to see if the rocket goes after the flame, but it doesn't. It continues to go after Johnny. Johnny puts his power back on, eventually goes and tries to get some portion of something to make it to where it's that uh, there is a an oil tanker that is on a massive amount of fire, to where really we have it to where that rocket ends up hitting this oil tanker instead of hitting Johnny, but then eventually Johnny dunks himself into the water uh, because of the massive explosion. So we eventually have it to where Sue is going to try and rescue Reed. And while that is going on, we end up having the Baxter building, who is getting lit up like a Christmas tree. So we end up having Sue, who ends up turning invisible and ends up going and trying to rescue Reed. And we end up having Doom start to attack Sue and like throw her into this desk where she like demolishes through the desk. So we end up having eventually Sue and Victor fighting it out, and it's a really cool sequence. But then eventually we end up having it to where Ben ends up coming back as the Thing and ends up putting a punch through Victor, which ends up hitting him through this wall, which ends up having these things fall down, blah, 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 blah. So we end up having both Sue and Ben trying to fix Reed to get him to be of a normal temperature and kind of cool off again. So we end up having it to where both Doom and Ben are now fighting it out. We end up having them crashing through the building which Doom was at to eventually make it into some other building where they are fighting through this pool to where eventually they're like just fighting through this building from floor to floor to floor to floor. So we eventually have it to where eventually Doom and Ben are to eventually go into the streets. To eventually, Ben is to throw a car at Doom and all kinds of things. And so we eventually push on to eventually have all the other Fantastic Four having the ability to come back to try and stop Doom. So, because we end up having a Victor who is going to almost kill Ben by stabbing him with something, but eventually Reed stops him from doing that, and he's like, "Oh well, like I'll get to you." And so eventually, like Sue tries to stop him, and then so eventually we get to the point of eventually them slowly but surely trying to attack Doom, and then eventually we end up having Reed who ends up kind of calling out what everybody's going to do. We end up having Johnny who ends up going into Supernova, like circling around Doom, while Doom is trying to hit Johnny with electricity. We end up having Sue who is supposed to contain the thing that is going around Johnny, to where eventually Johnny can no longer do this whole circling around, so he ends up just dropping off to the side. We end up having Ben, who's like, "Yeah, flame on, kid." So we end up having it to where now Doom is now a statuish like mess, to where he has no dangalang. He's a statue that has no Johnson. What is up with that? Like, basically, this guy should be like naked, but he's not, because there's no schwanz. Like, I guess we're pulling off the Silver Surfer thing here with Doom. So we end up having it to eventually Reed is giving Doom a science lesson. What happens when you rapidly cool a hot metal? And so we end up having Ben, who ends up going and breaking the hydrant to shoot out this water, to where Reed is to go and use the water to have it go and hit Doom, to where we end up having now Doom is forcibly just a statue. So everybody's like, "Yeah, we won, we did it, woohoo!" And so everybody's like, "Victory has been had this day." So we end up having the Fantastic Four, then ends up, because they won, go onto some boat where they're like relishing in their victories, and we end up having it to where reasonably Ben is completely fine now with being a Ben Grimm of the Thing, and so we end up having everybody like kind of like having a good party. We end up having Johnny who's ordering shots and all kinds of things. So we end up having both Sue and Reed who are to go off to the side, and so we end up having Reed who ends up proposing to Sue, and Sue of course says yes. I remember one part of this movie where we end up having Reed mention to Sue that that Reed thought that Sue wanted a stronger man, and that's when he like bows out his chin in a funny, goofy way. But I think in the deleted scenes, they bizarrely made it look like Wolverine. Weirdly, I don't know why, but I guess at that point in time, maybe Sue and Wolverine had a story together bizarrely, or maybe like Sue Storm really liked Wolverine. I don't know what the thing was. So we go on, and we have both Sue and Reed who are now engaged. We end up having Johnny who ends up going out and flaming out a 4 into the sky. And we really have it to where everybody's like, yeah, they're celebrating their victory and they're celebrating their winning and their whatever. And now Sue and Reed are engaged. So really, that's how the movie tends to end, with Victor Von Doom being crated off to somewhere, like to be examined, I guess, by top men. Who? Top men. And that's the way the movie just ends. So with that said, I guess I'm going to get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.